I think whilst we're on the subject of the discussions of Weimar Germany, nationalism as a concept, and what's been happening over the last couple of days with the National Conservatism conference that's been happening, organised by the Edmund Burke Society, I think it's worth pointing out this particular part of a speech by well-known not fascist, definitely not fascist, Douglas Murray on the discussions of nationalism as a concept at this particular conference. Let's have a listen.
This is in some ways still a controversial thing to say, because in Europe in particular, nationalism, after all, sounds different depending on the country you're in. Nationalism in Israel sounds different to nationalism in America, sounds different to nationalism in Italy, sounds different to nationalism here in Britain. But the cordon sanitaire, which used to exist around nationalism until recent years, existed not because we didn't trust the idea of love of country, not because, I would argue, there was anything wrong with nationalism in a British context. It all came from a recognition that there was a problem with nationalism in a German context. And that is simply a historical fact. But I see no reason why every other country in the world should be prevented from feeling pride in itself because the Germans mucked up twice in a century.
Yeah, a real mucking up, yeah, right? Just a little oopsie that the Germans did, a little hollow oops that they engaged in there. And I think it's worth pointing out, really, that there's a kind of stark difference between the kind of civic nationalism that a lot of patriotic types will talk about, right? And I think, it may not be a specific ideology that I really sign up to, but I can understand the value people place on something like civic nationalism, for example, where you believe in the country as the utility of the concept of the state, and the covenant that was mentioned on Politics Live yesterday between the state and the citizen, for example, and wanting to improve that as much as you can, because I can get that. And then there's the kind of nationalism when you're talking about a people, British people, right? Because that's what was really, what we learned from the video that we just watched, really, around Weimar Germany, is like the German people as an ethnic group, as a racial group, as a national group. And that's where you start getting dangerous stuff like this. And I think it's worth pointing out from what was pointed out in chat by Tyrannax, in that people place this specific weight upon German nationalism as the root of this kind of aberration of what happens when nationalism takes hold. And this is also dangerous as well, because there have been so many different times in which the ideology of nationalism has led to the kind of stuff that we saw that happened in Nazi Germany. Why is it that nationalism can be separated by saying, well, there's just Germany. Germany did them, they did bad things, but they mucked up. But all the other nationalisms are fine. As if there wasn't nationalism and nationalist purging happening in Italy at literally the same time. Like, that's what the Axis powers were about. What about the kind of nationalism that you get in Russia, for example, that has probably led to a lot of what we're seeing happening in Ukraine now? What about the kind of nationalism in, I don't know, Serbia, the kind of nationalism that was repressed in Yugoslavia for a very long time, that led to the kind of attempted genocide by Milosevic in Bosnia? What about Idi Amin and the ethnic purges that he did in the name of Ugandan nationalism? What about Mobutu and Congolese nationalism? Right? The idea that, and Indonesian nationalism, I made this point on Twitter, what about Suharto? The kind of shit that he did in the name of Indonesian nationalism. The idea that there is just this singular aberration of German nationalism just being something that you can point to as a failure that you can then build on later, as if this isn't something that crops up again and again and again, when nationalism becomes a force as far as societal ideology is concerned. That's when we start getting the danger. And the thing is, we are seeing the similar kind of things now. I mean, what do you think that a lot of the issues that we had that was happening, like let's say take Serbia as an example, given about the economic woes that were happening in Serbia at the time, post breakup of Yugoslavia, right? There was ripe sentiment for there to be someone needing to blame for the economic downturn. This is why we see the kind of things like the National Conservatism conference that we're getting at the moment, these kind of things start cropping up. In the wake of the failures of capitalism, in the wake of the failures of conservative and right-wing political ideology and economic ideology, creating a well-off middle, prosperous and well-off middle class that then see their own position in the economic hierarchy in the country faltering. First of all, because of the innate upward funneling of wealth under capitalism that's led us with the starkest gap in incomes in this country. Not only at the same time that's caused a lot of migration, that has, for better or, they would argue for worse, has created the kind of multicultural society we're seeing at the moment, right? There is clearly there is the kind of the embers, right? The beginning embers of some kind of nationalist movement as a way of which people can try and create a scapegoat for the economic failures that we are seeing at the moment, because it's a conservative government's in charge that's done this, right? And they have nowhere else to go. They have nowhere else to go other than to prey on people's incredibly basic instincts to try and maintain power indefinitely. I've said already in this stream that no matter what you think about Brexit as a political policy, no matter what you think about that, there was a large part of Brexit that wanted to see the renown of Britain on the world stage increased, rather than the internationalism that we on the left should be embracing, right? Rather than international capitalism, international solidarity, right? Diplomatic unified diplomacy and diplomatic arrangements between countries based upon shared interests and shared global interests of everybody, the global proletariat, for example. That's not something that you get out of conservative ideology, and that stuff can that stuff can completely go under the surface when you have a prosperous society where there is a thriving middle class, who are usually the beneficiaries of these kind of things because they be part of the hegemonic ethnic and cultural and national groups within the country, for example. But as soon as that starts faltering, these sentiments can start coming from the other side. It's quite frankly, it is the prosperity of the era, for example, of Tony Blair that could have led to the fiscal conservative but socially liberal policies of David Cameron to be even possibly allowed to get into power in the first place, because the nationalist sentiments of conservatism at the time were abated by the prosperous nature of British society. And this is why I think the quote about fascism being capitalism in decay is so apt, because it is the last refuge of capitalist institutions that have no justification for their own existence anymore, so have to find some other way of doing so, and appealing to the nation state and the nature in which that these become part of the fabric of society is really easy way of being able to maintain that power. I actually think the most dangerous speaker we've seen at the National Conservatism conference so far is Miriam Cates, because of her absolutely fucking overt hatred of everything queer. Like, the one who is closest to a fascist that I've seen is genuinely Miriam Cates. The way she talks about people, she's one step away from calling Britain as a country completely kind of beset by degeneracy, in the same way that you would have heard from fascists of the past, right? Talking about, liberal attitudes towards, sexuality and non-Christian values in the same way that kind of Ben Shapiro would. She's really dangerous, Miriam Cates, and I'm glad that it's unlikely that she will be in any kind of power sometime soon. Unfortunately, there were no clips, Miss Hire. Let me find a transcript of what it was that she was saying. So she begins by talking about that there's the overarching threat to Western civilization is not enough babies, right? And we all know the kind of rhetoric that you get around a prosperous future for white children, for example, and declining birth rates. That's You know, there are people outside of the fascist sphere who talk about this stuff, and some of them who don't. But almost all fascists will talk about the desire for needing new progeny. Right? That's where the reactionary sentiment about the natural place of women as mothers comes from, and great replacement theory stuff as well. That's very dangerous. That's really dangerous. But you can't extrapolate from just this that it's fascism, because there are a lot of people who are concerned with birth rates for economic reasons, right? Needing population growth in general as an economic thing is separate from great replacement stuff. The story about the birth rate is a slight borrow from people like Orban and Maloney. They're specific about the need for domestic births as against repopulation via immigration. Not making this point explicitly. And she thinks that it's social factors but doesn't mention housing. She argues against no-fault divorce, the two-child benefit limit, and not wanting more childcare provision, but wanting to put women back in the home to be mothers as incentivized as bringing up children, right? And in blaming immigration for lack of housing to be able to do that. And here comes the biggie, right? She starts talking about cultural Marxism, which, for those who are uninitiated, is a bastardization of the Nazi anti-Semitic conspiracy theory called Der Bolschewismus, or Kulturbolschewismus, or cultural Bolshevism in English, which is a conspiracy theory that Marxist intellectuals are trying to undermine Western values by infiltrating into the intelligentsia, spreading hatred of white people, and wanting to manufacture consent for increased immigration to dilute Western culture, which is obviously a Nazi conspiracy theory. And anyone who says that should absolutely be wary of. Not that the Board of Deputies think so. They cleared Suella Braverman for talking about cultural Marxism, as they think that's fine, of course, because only left-wing people can be anti-Semitic as far as they're concerned, or as far as the Jewish Chronicle is concerned, anyway. And one of the things that you hear about a lot of the time when people talking about cultural Marxism and the idea that Marxist intellectuals and academics are poisoning the minds of young people. It's interesting that there was an article in Policy Exchange, and there was an article in the Telegraph that referenced a study from Policy Exchange with an American political scientist talking about the idea that academics were poisoning children's brains with left-wing progressive ideology, the kind of stuff that Matt Goodwin was talking about. I referenced this Policy Exchange study in my dissection of Matt Goodwin's intellectual thought. He was here, by the way. Matt Goodwin was here, so all those people thinking he's not some kind of right-wing fanatic are looking pretty silly right now, but I digress. In this article, he discusses the way in which there's this prevailing consensus on the right wing that the reason why young people disagree with them so fervently is because they're being indoctrinated. They're being indoctrinated by schools, they're being indoctrinated by people in positions of cultural power. That's where a lot of the term cultural Marxism comes from. And they cannot possibly entertain the idea that the younger generation might have moved towards a left-wing political philosophy because of the material conditions they've been subjected to. Now, I've talked a lot about this on this channel, but I think it's worth putting in this video so that I have a specific segment around it. This is a theory that I have, which is that when a lot of people look at the ways in which ideologies pervade throughout society, they fundamentally believe everything naturally within liberal democracy, sat on an ideological bell curve, where at the top of the bell curve, most people are centrist, and then you have the political extremes, which are a small minority, right? And they view the increased left-wing sentiment amongst young people as being outside of the natural state of the ideological distribution amongst society. Right? They look at loads of young people being socialist or left-wing, communist, anarchist, social democrat, progressive in general, I guess. They look at a group of young people who are profoundly different ideological to their predecessors and think, well, this fits outside of this internal thought I have about the kind of natural bell curve of the ideological distribution of society. So, as it's come from outside, there must be some kind of outside force that's changing the natural state to be this way, rather than what we would look at as leftists. As I am a Marxist, obviously, I don't shy away from saying so. Regular viewers of the channel will know that I don't. They talk. We will understand this through historical materialism. The ideologies and the policies that get passed are based upon the material conditions that people respond to ideologically. Right? We're not idealists. We're materialists in the way that our explanation would be, well, young people are left wing because capitalism has failed them on a material basis. Have they got materially more wealthy? No. Have they got materially more prosperous? No. Are they even having their basic needs met as they get gouged half of their income on rent? No, of course they're not. Why would they support capitalism? And once you get into anti-capitalist philosophy, you get into a lot of anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, progressive philosophy outside of that, which comes alongside that kind of thing. And that's really why. That's why young generations are left, and not just left wing, getting more left wing over the time. The longer we spend within capitalism, the more that we actually become more left wing, rather than the general consensus received wisdom opinion on this, which is the older you get, the more conservative that you get as you generate asset wealth. That's what they would say. Where are millennials' asset wealth coming from? We're not generating wealth. We're living paycheck to paycheck, well into our 40s in some cases, especially if you are from a working class background rather than a middle class background. Although even though the middle class is being squeezed due to the steep inflation of asset prices that, as Gary Stevenson continues talking about on his channel. So it's only natural based on our material conditions as a reaction to this drop in living standards, or this failure to have increasing living standards that our predecessors did, but also, the failure to create a unified society that values community, that values the social contract, that values togetherness, right? Because that's what our generation values. We do value these communitarian, collectivist things, and neoliberalism goes straight against that, in that it individualizes people, atomizes people, it breaks the social contract. The social contract is absolutely strewn across the floor of the halls of the UK's ideology, and is only going further away rather than coming together, which is what leftists and young people want, and progressives want. They want something about the social contract. And I think you're right, Miss Hire, in that Greece is seeing a similar thing with regards to the rise of Syriza and Mira, in the desire for huge sections of the population to want to see radical economic change to be able to fix the downturn that they're seeing amongst working people in that country. When you look at a lot of the support for right wing parties in other countries in Europe, there's a lot of young sentiment, but middle class sentiment going towards the kind of reactionary right wing parties that are on the rise in Europe as a response to increased immigration that's coming out of poor interventionist policy in countries around the world, in poor climate policy, etc., etc. And when you look at all these things, right, these material things that are making young people more like left wing, making them more progressive, if you can't fundamentally look at this through a materialist lens like a leftist does, you cannot, based upon this assumption you have about radical things only existing in the fringe, then well, hang on, they cannot exist normally. This cannot be a natural phenomenon under this bell curve theory. There has to be a fifth column, right? There has to be an infiltrator. There has to be someone that's indoctrinating these people. And they go after schools, they go after universities, they go after academia, which is where the cultural Marxism stuff comes from. And Policy Exchange commissioned a study to try and prove this, and it was wrong. Right? Policy Exchange found out that people weren't learning about progressivism in school. They weren't learning about intersectionality at universities. They weren't learning about anti-racism from academics. They were learning it on social media. They were learning it from their peer groups. They were learning it from their friends. This is a nascent political ideology that is spreading through people as a response to their own material conditions in their own existence. There's nothing to do with indoctrination in schools and universities and in places of learning. But that is irreconcilable with the right side and the centre's idea that capitalism is a faultless hegemonic political and economic ideology, and that anyone who falls outside of that must therefore have been indoctrinated and have had facts put into their head by unscrupulous individuals. And this is dangerous because that is where cultural Marxism would come from. That is where the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory stuff would come from. And there is no evidence for any of this stuff. It's why Matt Goodwin fails. It's why Miriam Cates fails. It's why Scholar Braverman fails, because they fundamentally misdiagnose where young people's ideology comes from and the reasons why we differ so greatly ideologically from them. And also it does help, right? That you have everyone's all heard the kind of George Soros conspiracies and things like that, because the right wing obviously have lots of funding, and Matt Goodwin knows this because Matt Goodwin gets loads of money from fucking the Legatum Institute, and this conference was hosted by the Edmund Burke Foundation, which is just another think tank having loads of dark money funneled into it. The conservative ideology and the nationalist ideology is absolutely rampant in society because it's had so much money pumped into it for years and years and years by capitalist institutions wanting to maintain hegemonic power, and now they can't do it through economic policy. They have to do it through playing on people's fears. Fear is a great motivator. Why do you think these cultural conservatives want to give you the fear of being assaulted by a trans person? The fear of what might happen if we have laws that help the existence of trans people. The scary men in dresses wanting to come into your bathrooms to attack your children. Think of the children, think of the women, right? The idea of racism and fascism and all these kind of ideologies playing on people's fears of minorities is well documented, right? Right? It's not a feminist to use the fear of black people in in 1900 early 1900s America as a justification for segregationist policies, which the right in America did do. They did say, well, you can't let black people into these spaces. They will attack women, right? They were wanting to protect women, quote unquote, in their words. This wasn't feminist. This wasn't progressive. This was a reactionary. This was using the perceived frailty of women as a political class to want to engender a culture of fear around a minority that they wanted to use to maintain power. And this is where all the cultural stuff against trans people comes from, because fear is an incredibly great motivator, and that's what's dangerous. That's why we can't have, fucking stony-faced pragmatism on the other side. We have to fight fear with hope. Hope for better, hope for change, hope for a better future for everybody, a community together, adhering to a social contract. And that's why I believe that the current trajectory of the Labour Party will lead us to very dark times ahead because they won't fix the economic problems. And the cultural problems will continue to bubble up as the right wing further plays on these narratives of fear. And not only this, I'm not going to pick on centrists again because I do it a lot. Well, not only are centrists they've looked at these kind of things. They've seen the outward displays of fascist rhetoric, all the stuff about cultural Marxism, the Great Replacement theory stuff, looking at, for example, what Douglas Murray was saying about nationalism as a force in Germany. And they're wringing their hands. They're looking at these kind of things and going, "This is terrifying. I can't believe someone would say this in our liberal democracy." And all of the leftists are here, like going, "You could read this in the Spectator." The Spectator was saying this for decades and decades, right? The Spectator is where all of the fucking fancy journalists in their expensive dresses with their drinking their glasses of champagne, for example, along with Labour MPs and Liberal Democrat MPs, swanning around to the garden party discussing with the kind of people who you're now absolutely feigning this level of shock around the kind of ideology that they're expressing. I'm like, yeah, this was always there. And leftists were warning about this. In fact, we were warning about this during Gamergate, for example, which is ironic considering what Graham Lemon's doing now. Like, we told you this was going to happen. We fucking told you. I'm so sick of leftists being correct over and over and over again. The kind of mass shooters as a result of ingrained misogyny in society, the mass shooters from the rise of fascism that were happening in America and things like that. Centrists just blindly strolling on through society looking after their mortgage equity. And then suddenly the jam man comes along and he's suddenly the biggest threat to their livelihoods. Whilst the seeds of far right ideology has always been there, and leftists were telling you. And now that it's here, in the limelight, being spoken about by some of the most powerful people in the country, and there they're going, oh, pearl clutching. I can't believe the UK is, people from the UK are saying these things. I'm like, they were already saying these things. But because of where you've allowed the country to get to by demonising the alternative, they feel happy to openly say it now. You did indeed get exactly what you wanted. And the centrists only have themselves to blame. And what is scary as well is the amount to which, the amount to which the kind of ethno-nationalist policies that we're seeing, or the rhetoric that we're seeing, rather than policies, ethno-nationalist rhetoric that we're seeing, is being used to manufacture consent for the kind of stuff that we're hearing, that we're seeing in Israel right now. Right? Obviously, these things have been endemic to plenty of societies of other religions and other ethnic groups across society, for example. But the fever pitch of the kind of fascist rhetoric in Israel is incredibly high at the moment. And this is now the time where we should have the most robust condemnation of the kind of thing that Netanyahu's doing. Yet instead what you get are the actual far-right people, the anti-Semitic far-right people, no less, the same people talking about cultural Marxism, in huge support of countries like Israel because they view them as the ideal ethno-state. They want Israel to crush Palestinians because they want to create a uni-ethnic state with ethnic supremacy for a certain group of people as a justification for, well, that's their country, they should go to that country. And that's dangerous. That's dangerous, right? No ethno-states are never justified, regardless of the situation, right? Rather than creating the kind of pluralist society that we should be championing to protect ourselves against the events of the 1930s and 40s, we're doing the opposite of that and playing into people's base instincts about ethnic supremacy. And the only voice that we've had to speak against that has been called anti-Semitic by the same people who view Israel as the country for Jewish people, where the Jewish people should be as a blueprint for their ethnically homogenous society. And that's dangerous. Yeah, we should be very scared. We should be very scared about where things like this are going. However, what I will say is that there is at least a small amount of hope in what people are talking about here, and is that the British public actually don't agree. When you survey the British public, they really don't agree. They are not playing to a large group of supporters. They really aren't, which is why it seems I'm fucking incredulous that Labour are going with a similar kind of rhetoric as well. Stuff that what Deletion Course was talking in the chat about, the shit that Nandi was saying about social conservatism. That's dangerous too. Accepting this rhetoric rather than countering it and countering the narrative is very, very dangerous. But when you actually look at the statistics, right, the idea that there's some kind of white Christian core value that John, as JBM talks about here, that the National Conservatism Conference has been discussing as some kind of unifying ideology amongst British people, that is not the case anymore whatsoever, right? We are the most pluralist we've ever been in this regard. We are the least Christian that we've ever been, obviously the least white that we've ever been. They are speaking to an incredibly tiny minority of the British population who were already voting for them anyway, right? This is consolidation. This is blind. This is not electioneering. This is blind ideology talking here. Pure ideology. They're not doing this to win votes. They're doing this because this is what they really believe in, and they always have really believed in. People talking, when you look at the things that people talk about Britishness, they don't talk about ethnicity or religion at all in the same way these people do. They talk about, just being born in Britain and speaking English. You can slice and dice the data however you like, but ultimately the types of people headlining at the National Conservatism Conference are part of a small and shrinking minority whose views are already way out of line with what most Brits actually think, and only growing more so, which makes it all the more baffling that they keep trying desperately to get these lines out into the public domain. It's just reminding voters how completely detached these people are from the vast majority of the electorate. Honestly, I find it mind-blowing. All the data suggests that it's the cultural rhetoric which has completely toxified the Conservative brand amongst under 50s, far more so than economic factors. And I think that it's actually, quite frankly, it is indeed a combination of both. But it is interesting that they just don't. It seems that there's a party in tailspin, but it's just incredibly frustrating that Labour think that they need to play to these people specifically to win. It's almost like that was the ideology that they already had, and they are just coming out with it now because they really don't value progressivism at all. I think Sienna Rogers was only mainstream journalist who said that Starmer was right wing in 2020. She couldn't believe people on the left bought into him. I mean, Sienna Rogers is someone who I have a lot of time and respect for at the very least, right? And what's interesting as well is when you look at what people care about. I've mentioned this before. Like all the cultural stuff is toxifying the Conservative brand. JBM is 100% correct. People want to see a functioning NHS. They want to see the cost of living crisis addressed. And they don't want to see this cultural nonsense. They don't want to see the rise of national conservatism. They want their fucking bills paid, right? And this is not going to help them pay their bills. And luckily, I think that because of the events of the mucking up, as Douglas Murray will put it, of the Germans in the 1930s, has insulated a lot of the world to buying into this kind of stuff. And they realise that, they do actually just genuinely need their material interests satiated, and they don't need to buy into a scapegoat narrative like the Conservative Party is trying to throw at them. So, that is at least something to take some kind of solace in. The fact that these opinions are changing, that they don't represent a large portion of this country, but they will only continue to do so if there is no viable political alternative coming from the left. And that's the problem. We do not have a viable political alternative from the left. If you enjoyed this video, please do consider liking and subscribing. It does help out the channel and the algorithm. And if you click the bell notification icon, it will let you know when I go live and when I upload videos. If you'd like to follow me on social media, my handle is @NoJusticeMTG, and that is Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitch, and YouTube. If you want to support my channel in a more financial manner, you can do so by becoming a member for just 99p, by super chatting, or by supporting me on Patreon, with the link is in the description of this video, and hopefully I'll catch you on the next segment.